You strong.
Timur watches mesmerized by what is happening and realizes that his main task is to protect Vivian. Nickel jumps up and finds himself right in front of Kushane's muzzle. His attention is focused only on Nickel. He loses sight of Andreas, who attacks him from behind, swinging his sword at him. Andreas happily realizes that they are doing great. Everything is going just as he had planned. Andreas stabs his sharp sword into the monster's back with all his insane strength. The Kushane monster wriggles in pain and howls loudly, raising its muzzle upwards. At this point, Andreas gloatingly tells him that he will now become undead. Suddenly, an electronic board appears in front of him, writing that the sealed sword Galaxir has discovered the blood of an ancient magical beast. Andreas's eyes are bloodshot. His eyebrows furrow into a frown. The scoreboard reads that right now the absorption of Kushane's blood by the Galaxir sword is taking place. A magical pink color begins to emanate from the sword stuck in Kushane's back. Andreas continues to hold it tightly in his hand. On the electronic scoreboard, it is written that the action of greed ends and the kickback begins. Andreas looks at the scoreboard in bewilderment and doesn't understand what it means. Blood is frozen on his lips. Vivian is terrified, trying to call out loudly for him, screaming his name. She worries for him with all her heart. The Galaxir sword remains in the body of Kushane's monster. A bright light begins to emanate from the wound. At this time, Andreas falls to the ground with a thud. Vivian breaks free from Timur's clutches and rather rushes to Andreas's aid. The monster Kushane begins to wriggle and squirm in pain. A bright flash engulfs his entire body. Andreas lies motionless beside him as Vivian rushes towards him as fast as she can. The monster Kushane begins to slowly disintegrate and dissolve. It makes scary noises. Vivian holds Andreas by the shoulders while he leans back against her. They both stare mesmerized at what is happening to Kushane. The electronic scoreboard reads that the blood of the magical beast has released the first seal of the Galaxy sword. The monster is completely engulfed in bright red light. It slowly continues to disintegrate into pieces and disappear. Andreas marvels at the fact that Kushane's blood is so important to his sword Galaxir. Vivian cautiously asks Andreas, trying to make sure it's over. They watch mesmerized behind the disappearing Kushane. Vivian clutches Andreas tightly to her chest. At this time, Andreas sincerely apologizes to her for putting her in danger. Vivian calmly looks away. A smile appears on her face. She replies to Andreas that everything is fine and, most importantly, that everyone is safe. Andreas also apologizes for the fact that Kushane dissolves completely, and in its place remains Andreas's sharp sword, Galaxir, stuck into the ground. Nickel and Timur look on from the sidelines. Vivian replies to him that his words do not change the fact that he is his Mr. Fey. At this moment, Andreas is peacefully contemplating whether there has ever been a time when he was completely trusted, as Vivian has now done. In a large arena with sharp peaks on the roof, the 111th opening ceremony of Rodlin Academy begins. A bearded man standing behind the podium tells Mr. Louis Artman, who has won first place in his class, to come to the podium right now. Behind him stands Mr. Alwyn and several other people. Andreas realizes that this is where the game really begins. A guest enters the arena. This is Mr. Louis Artman, who has shown excellent results in his studies and behavior. Andreas sits as an observer in the stands, with Lucius sitting next to him and telling him something. He thinks only of the fact that he has somehow managed to live up to this moment, despite the lack of important information. Next to him on the other side, Vivian appears. Andreas continues to think with a smile on his face that even though he now has to protect more people than before, and that at the same time, it gives him strength. Andreas faces some fearsome mages, including Jester himself. He realizes that there are now many big events awaiting him, and he decides that he will not run away from them. Andreas stands resolutely behind the podium, with Lucius and Vivian standing on opposite sides of him. Andreas decides that this is a war for the 7 deadly sins. Andreas walks off into the distance, leaving a bloody Vivian and several slain knights to bleed. It is announced in the arena that the floor is next turned over to Mr. Louis Artman, the top student in his year of study. Louis Artman reads from a leaf a pledge that he and the new students of the class of 111 Andreas watches intently. Luis says loudly that they vow that they will stand shoulder to shoulder with the older students at the proud Rodlin Academy. He promises that they will strive to be the sword and shield that protects the Empire and its inhabitants. One of the onlookers, a guy with blue hair, stands and listens intently to what Luis is saying. The girl with pink hair and the many students also stand mesmerized and listen. Luis continues to promise to be heroes who bring the word of empire. He completes his oath and introduces himself to everyone by name, calling himself Luis Artman, the first-year representative. After finishing his speech, he walks confidently down the stairs. He looks very confident. He's looking somewhere. He looks up at the podium and sees that there are adult undergraduate students seated there. They look down on Luis with undisguised disdain. They look much older than he does. Luis looks at them apprehensively. He notices that they all look stylish. His gaze moves to another podium. On it are a cocky Andreas in a robe, Lucius, Vivian, and other undergraduate students. Luis notices that the robe means that this student is a magic student. What scares him is that he has a sword. He is incredulous that Rodlin Academy has such an unusual student in its midst. He smiles slightly. It's a warm and clear day. There is not a single cloud in the sky. It is clear and bright. Someone discusses that random duels where it doesn't matter what department he's from. He remarks that this is going to be a lot of fun. Rodlin Academy is starting their spring tournament. One student says that they are freshmen now and it's okay, but next year they will compete too. Another agrees and says that they can watch in peace and not worry about anything and that they can learn something. Luis walks by and realizes that even watching from the sidelines will be good because they will see a lot of techniques and skills. He is glad to see that the mage faculty will also be participating in the tournament. At that moment, he grazes a senior student and he spills coffee on himself, leaving a mark. The latter looks at him angrily and calls him a bastard. Luis apologizes to him guiltily and says that he just didn't notice him. Luis's eyes see a huge fist pointed at him. He stares fearfully. A senior student angrily asks him about his eyes being on his ass. At that moment, he punches Luis in the face with all his might so that he flies off into the distance, covering his face. Louis falls to the floor and hits his back on the table where Dina Alwyn is sitting. She jumps up in surprise and drops her coffee mug. The senior student folds his arms across his chest and notes that Louis blocked the blow better than any night, and it looks like he didn't just perform in front of everyone in the arena today. Luis angrily gets down on one knee and stares at him without taking his eyes off. At this time, Lucia, who was sitting next to Lena Alwyn, looks at him fearfully, trying to pull away. Luis looks at his palms and notes that his punch wasn't very fast, but it's very heavy, so he couldn't stop it. A senior student angrily explains to Luis that the uniform he ruined is very expensive. Ott demands 100,000 wills from him, and then he'll let him get away with it. Luis stands there confused and looks at him. At that moment, Lucia jumps out of her seat and indignantly yells that this is extortion. Dina and Lucia look on in amazement. Lucia is outraged beyond belief. She loudly asks the senior student about where his honor is. After all, he is not a poor man. Vivian sips his coffee nonchalantly. Dina, without turning to face him, addresses him by the name Todlin. She tells him that it looks like he's ready to be disqualified for the sake of causing a stir in the street. At this moment, she arrogantly turns around to face the senior student and stares at him piercingly. She continues to nonchalantly tell the upperclassman that by his logic, he owes her 100,000 wills. Todlin and Louise stare at her dumbfounded eyes wide. Todlin recognizes her and realizes that his affairs are bad. His eyebrows frown, his mouth opens slightly. He didn't expect her to be an unwitting witness to this incident. Dina raises her hand menacingly and tells Todlin to look where she is pointing. She does not take her stern gaze off him. Todlin indignantly turns around to leave and tells Luis that he's lucky, calling him a first-timer. Luis looks at him confused. Dina, Luis, and Lucia look at Todlin as he leaves. Luis is smiling, Dina is looking at him sternly, and Lucia is outraged beyond belief at this behavior. Luis touches the back of his head in confusion and lowers his gaze. He sincerely thanks the girls for saving him from that insolent upperclassman. Dina smiles good-naturedly, and Lucius asks him cheerfully about the fact that he's the first-year spokesman, isn't he? He looks happy to be known about him. He pretty much answers that he is, introducing himself as Louis Artman. Dina calls herself by her first and last name and says she is a fourth year at the academy. Lucius talks about herself and mentions that she's a second year. She adds that he's unlucky to get into trouble so quickly. Dina stands by the table and looks at the newcomer with interest. Vivian continues to drink coffee. Luis rubs his head in embarrassment. Dina tells him that everything is fine, because that guy named Todlin is the best in the Knight's faculty. Vivian gets up from her seat after finishing her coffee and says she has to go. Louis looks at her perplexed. She says that Andreas's match is about to start. The moment she mentions him, her face breaks into a smile and a blush appears on her cheeks. Luis looks at her admiringly and clarifies the fact that she's a swordsman too, and says he's very pleased to meet her. Dina looks at Vivian with a sidelong glance. Luis extends his hand in a friendly way as a sign of familiarity. Dina looks at him blankly. Dina looks at her a little confused. After a few seconds, Vivian also extends her hand to him in agreement. Vivian looks extremely serious and closed. Her gaze is indifferent and she wants to get out of here as soon as possible. At this point, Lucia starts giggling to lighten the mood, thinking that Vivian is a very strange girl. She says that she would also like to see Andreas fight and suggests that they all go together. Dina looks at Lucia in surprise and clarifies the fact that she wants to go too. She didn't think she liked that sort of thing. Lucia winks playfully and clenches her fist. She good-naturedly tells Dina not to talk like that, because even she sometimes gets breathless at something like that. Dina asks her about whether she herself will be in the tournament. Lucia, embarrassed and slightly averting her gaze, replies to her that no, she is not going to participate in the tournament. Dina looks at Luis and tells him that it's time for them to go and invites him to go with them. Luis is excited about the invitation and says that he would like to watch the tournament too. Dina smiles kindly and finishes by saying that they will all go together then. Many people have gathered in the arena. Everyone is eager for beautiful fights and is waiting impatiently for the start of the competition. Luis looks at the arena with wide-eyed admiration. He talks about how amazing it is and that it's just as he thought it would be. Rodlin Academy is on a whole other level. Vivian sits next to him in silence. Dina and Lucius sit next to them, and Dina notes that asshole wasn't bad. The next contestants are announced. Luis is excited that a new fight is about to begin. Vivian is looking forward to Andreas coming out. The very same senior student enters the arena. The announcer announces that in the blue corner is the best from the Knight's faculty, Todlin Terry. He adds that everyone expects great results from him in this tournament. The announcer announces his opponent in the red corner, Andreas Cromwell. At this moment, he walks resolutely into the arena. His robe is fluttering nobly. The host says of him that he is from the fourth year of the magic faculty. Luis goes wide-eyed with amazement, for Todlin Terry is the very same abuser from the cafeteria. Vivian looks admiringly at Andreas without uttering a word. She is absolutely certain of his victory. Louis recognizes Andreas Cromwell as well. He looks at him admiringly, for it is Andreas who has gotten a lot of attention after inventing a new potion. Andreas looks absolutely confident. On his belt, he carries the very same sword Galaxir. Luis recalls seeing Andreas at the admission ceremony. He recalls the image of Andreas and how he stood smugly behind the podium with his arms folded at his waist. He thinks about the fact that he would really be fighting a knight with swords. The host announces to the opponents to prepare for the duel. Todlin smugly asks Andreas if he is the mage who is pretending to be a swordsman. Andreas stands silent and stares at him. He prepares himself for the upcoming fight. Andreas looks indifferently at Todlin and replies to him that he is not making anything of himself, but he can think as he pleases. Todlin is starting to get angry. He angrily tells him, furrowing his eyebrows, that he's an arrogant bastard. The announcer announces the start of the fight. Todlin moves at lightning speed at Andreas, swinging his sword at him, telling him to show him the real weight of the sword. He looks furious. The announcer announces that Todlin immediately starts the fight with a swift attack. Lucia turns to Dina and asks her if she knew that Todlin would be Andreas's opponent. Dina looks at her perplexed and doesn't know what she's talking about. The enthusiastic spectators shout from the stands. Lucia clarifies that she heard that there will be a meeting with the students from Milko Academy after this tournament. Dina begins to realize what she means. Dina looks at Lucia and informs her that someone said that those who show outstanding results can go to the meeting, though she'll still be forced to go there. Lucia looks at Dina carefully and listens to what she is telling her. Dina recalls her father smugly noting that if she comes, the difference between them and Milko Academy will be even more pronounced. Lucia, with a smile on her face, notes that this is a rather unpleasant situation. Dina silently agrees and smiles too. Andreas and Todlin are in for a hell of a fight. They are both very good with their swords. Dina remembers that she also heard that those who get high places in the tournament will also be able to go to a meeting. Dina looks at Vivian and says that she should be able to place high in this tournament. Lucia gives her a leer too. At this time, Vivian is completely immersed in Andreas and Todlin's fight. She is absolutely certain that Andreas will win. Dina brings up how Vivian put up a great fight yesterday and got the win. She notes that she has a good chance after beating Aaron yesterday, as he was the best competitor yesterday. Meanwhile, a furious battle continues in the arena. Todlin takes a swing at Andreas as Andreas skillfully dodges it. This begins to annoy Todlin. He furiously calls him a bastard and tells him to stop dodging. Todlin is holding a sword in one hand and holding its point with the other hand. He looks angrily at Andreas and tells him that he didn't think he would have to show someone like him his strongest technique. Andreas looks at him arrogantly, squinting his eyes. In response to this provocation, he simply remains silent. As Andreas stands and stares at Todlin, the latter lightning leaps from his seat and disappears from sight. Todlin ends up on Andreas's side. He jumps up high and presses his lips together. Andreas looks perplexed at the place where he was just now, but he is not there either. He can't keep up with his movements. In a second, Todlin is already behind Andreas. Todlin swings his sword furiously, trying to hit him from behind. Andreas absolutely can't keep up with Tolden's movements. The announcer notes that Tolden Terry is making ferocious lunges towards Andreas, leaving him in a bad position. Luis looks dumbfounded at what is happening in the arena and realizes that he's seen something similar before. Vivian calmly, with a smile on his face, watches the fight. Vivian looks peaceful. She says that Mr. Fay will win without taking her eyes off him. Louis squints at her, perplexed. Todlin furiously asks Andreas about how his sword is just a piece of jewelry. He swings his sword around and provokes Andreas by telling him about showing him his magic that he is so proud of. The announcer announces that now Andreas Cromwell can only dodge. At this point, Andreas gets behind Todlin and swings his arm at him. The announcer says that everyone will now see the outcome of the fight. The onlookers are dumbfounded as they watch what is happening, their eyes bulging and their mouths wide open in amazement. At that second, Andreas, without even using his sword, slams Todlin's head against the floor. Tolden sprawled on the floor, letting his sword out of his hand. Andreas stands up and glares arrogantly at his opponent. Todlin lies unmoving. He looks down at Todlin Terry, and as if to answer him, says that he has no need of sword or magic against one such as he. The audience stares in amazement and opens their mouths in surprise. The announcer excitedly shouts out that it was unbelievable. He says that Lodlin Terry was defeated by a fourth-year student from the Faculty of Magic.
Andreas stands confidently on the tiles that have been cracked by his blow, with his legs spread wide. The host announces the winner, Andreas Cromwell. Andreas looks indifferently at his defeated foe, who lies face down on the floor, completely immobilized.
At that,
Luis looks stunned at Andreas. He is amazed that he has just defeated the best warrior from the Knights faculty with his bare hands. He wonders who he is.
Lucia is out.
Vivian looks absolutely happy and peaceful. She quietly calls Andreas Mr. Fairy. Lucia, sitting next to Vivian, opens her mouth wide at what Andreas has just done in front of everyone.
Him by the name Todlin.
Dina is also quite stunned by what has happened. She reasons that the wizard used the knight's mana to strengthen his body. Alwyn stands nonchalantly on the balcony with his arms folded across his chest, watching from on high. He realizes it was a double core. Alwyn's look is thoughtful and angry. He is convinced that it was the double core that Andreas just showed here. Alwyn looks at the determinedly walking Andreas and realizes that he is no longer going to hide him. Alwyn foresees an impending storm. The announcer in the arena announces that the last fight for tonight is over. He announces that the top 16 contenders will compete tomorrow. He encourages them to check the tables to see who they will be fighting.
Todlin.
Andreas walks silently down the sunlit corridor. He looks pensive and tired. Someone interrupts his train of thought and calls his name. He sees his friends in front of him. Lucius enthusiastically tells him that he did a great job and congratulates him. Vivian, Dina, and Luis stand silently behind her and stare at Andreas with undisguised surprise. Andreas, for his part, is surprised to see them all gathered together. He asks them about why they are here. Dina smiles good-naturedly as she looks at Andreas and says it just came out that way. Andreas doesn't quite understand why even Luis is here. He squints his eyes and frowns his eyebrows slightly. Luis stares at him admiringly, eyes wide, and doesn't take his gaze away from him. Luis introduces himself to Andreas, giving his name, and makes a small bow before him. Andreas in turn says his name. Andreas thinks about the fact that it's quite touching that he sees the first character he played on in Deadly Sins alive. He notices that he's even a little nervous. Dina tells Andreas that he surprised everyone during the fight, and that she didn't know he could use aura. Andreas stares at her indifferently without saying a word. Dina puts her hand to her chin and approaches Andreas, asking him about the fact that he never learned swordsmanship before because he didn't know about his abilities. She concludes that this means he recently started learning how to swing a sword. Andreas says that's about right. At that moment, he realizes that Dina is analyzing his every move. They are standing in a small circle, talking about something. Luis asks Andreas about the fact that he has only recently started to learn fencing, so how can he move like that? Vivian is only concerned that Lucius is standing so close to Andreas.
Her gaze is indifferent and she wants to get out of here as soon as possible.
Luis persistently asks Andreas what special methods he uses that are not taught at the academy. Andreas becomes annoyed that he is pushing hard, even though they have only just met. Andreas kindly tells him that it's nothing special and that he's just using his aura to strengthen his body. At this point, he reproaches himself for not having reached the speed at which the teacher could move.
Lucia winks playfully.
Lucia stands perplexed and listens to their conversation. She is silent. There is sadness in her eyes. Deshroon angrily stumbles away as Hosan leaves after packing his things. Andreas was the only apprentice Deshroon took in after Hosan left, and he only taught Luis the basics because he was interested in Luis's talent.
Dina looks at Luis and tells him that
That's why Luis still doesn't know how to apply the teacher's method of aura control. Luis, after Andreas's words, pensively looks at his hands and tries to understand how it is to strengthen the body by using the aura. Luis, smiling broadly and slightly nervous, asks Andreas if he doesn't mind to show him once how it is. He explains that it's hard for him to understand in words. Andreas would like to teach him, but there's no way to understand it in such a short time.
Rodlin Academy is on a whole other level.
Andreas good-naturedly raises his hand and says he's busy fighting right now. But, so as not to upset Luis, he says he might show it later if he has some free time. Luis bows to him and thanks him.
Excited that a new fight.
Andreas smiles and tells Luis that his eagerness to learn is impressive, even though the school year has just begun. Lucia stands beside him, arms folded at her sides, and confronts him for not telling her anything, even though they have been researching potions together for over half a year.
The announcer announces his...
Andreas sincerely apologizes to Lucia for this and explains to her that he just didn't want to stand out at the time. The only thing that bothers Vivian, standing next to him, is that he says they've been together for 6 months. Lucius is not relenting. She looks indignantly at Andreas and asks about why then he did it now. Andreas coughs and explains that he wanted to join a meeting of exchange students, since it's hard to work your way up with magic alone. He's actually hiding his skills, though, since the game characters might kill him. Lucius thinks about it and understands Andreas's position, for he has no talent for magic. Andreas smugly replies to her that he's been working hard on his fire magic lately. Through the wide archway of the corridor in which they stand, bright rays of sunlight creep in. Lucius smiles slightly embarrassed at Andreas and wishes him luck with the case.
Fact.
Andreas is a little hurt by Lucia's words that he supposedly has no talent for magic. He thanks her dryly. Andreas reasons that he hasn't seen an event in the game with a meeting of students from another academy. He realizes that he has no reason to make his way there, but there is one person at their academy that he would like to see. The game character, Keklun Violga. Vivian, smiling, says that she will try her best to go to this meeting with Andreas. Lucia, standing next to Andreas, laughs loudly, calling them both very ambitious. Dina, looking intently into her tablet, says that since they want to go there, they could use a first-place tag. She offers to look at the standings. Luis, not understanding anything, looks at Dina. What is shown in the standings greatly surprises Dina. Lucia explains that if they win, Vivian will face Dina when the top 4 contestants remain, and then whoever wins will fight Andreas in the finals.
Haters shout.
Dina's eyes are full of determination. She is absolutely confident in herself and her abilities. With a sly expression on her face, squinting her eyes slightly, Vivian replies that there's no way she's going to lose either. Andreas, absolutely certain of his superiority, quietly replies that he will try. Dina, putting the tablet away, good-naturedly suggests that they all go full out together. Lucia, with a wink, points out that there are 2 newcomers who could win the tournament, and the original contender to win is here as well. She adds that, come to think of it, the people who have the best chance of taking first place are here.
Agrees and smiles too.
Dina looks sternly at Lucia, while Luis giggles and asks about seeing something awesome. The 4 begin to slowly shave their way to the end of the hallway. Luis is told that he should be honored, since he is still just a rookie.
That she should.
5 days pass. The day of the tournament finals arrives. The host announces the start of the final bout of the 58th Rodlin Academy Spring Tournament. He invites the contestants to enter the arena. One of the finalists heads into the arena with a confident stride. The host says that there were many disappointments in this tournament, but only the best of the best made it to the final.
Yesterday.
Andreas walks confidently into the center of the arena. He looks focused and completely calm. The announcer announces him by name and says that he is a 4th-year student from the Faculty of Magic.
Him a bastard and tells him to.
His opponent approaches him. The announcer announces that it is the girl who stopped Vivian Belroken. She is another unexpected contender for the championship title. She is also a 4th-year student in the magic department. Dina Alwyn enters the arena. There is a slight look of consternation in her eyes and her lips are tight. The host announces that today, for the first time in 12 years, there are 2 mages in the finals.
Disappears from sight.
Vivian, sitting on the podium, asks Mr. Fay to try as hard as possible to win. Lucia, sitting next to her, squints slightly at Vivian and notes that she's a very different person in battle.
In a second,
the stands are full. Everyone is in anticipation of the finale. The host says that unexpected circumstances have attracted the attention of a large crowd, and so he proposes to begin immediately. He tells the contestants to get ready. Dina stands across from Andreas and apologizes to him for not giving him first place. Andreas smiles good-naturedly and advises her then to show her best from the start. The host loudly announces the start of the competition. Dina spreads her hands wide with palms up. At that moment, fireballs begin to emanate from them. She keeps her eyes on Andreas and says that she will do as he wishes. The people sitting in the stands are watching what is happening in the arena with their mouths ajar, frightened. A multitude of fireballs emanate from her palms and soar high up. Dina smugly says that she will finish quickly. Andreas stands nonchalantly and looks at her.
Andreas gets behind.
A frenzied excitement awakens in Andreas at the fact that a worthy opponent is fighting him. He pulls his Galaxir sword from his belt with a sly smile on his face and says it's time to get started. Andreas jumps up sharply, leaping out of his seat and heading straight for Dina to launch an attack. Dina, thrusting one arm forward, menacingly directs fireballs of fire at Andreas. Flashes of fire fly straight at Andreas, but he skillfully dodges them as he tries to sneak closer to Dina to attack her with his sword. Dina tries with all her might to throw fireballs as hard and accurately as possible, trying to hit Andreas. Dina is enraged beyond belief! She opens her mouth wide and is angry that she can't hit Andreas. Andreas moves from one place to another with lightning speed, trying to evade the balls and get closer to Dina. He does it perfectly. His eyes are burning bright red fire. Red wide. The host, Dina, unable to believe her eyes, is amazed at what she sees before her. Her teeth clenched, her eyes opened wide. Andreas grasped his sword with both hands and swept it in front of him, forming a pink-colored magical wall. Andreas stares in amazement at what Dina is doing. He opens his eyes wide in amazement. Dina bounces high behind his back. Andreas is startled to realize that she can already use spatial magic. Andreas, Mr. Fairy. With a sly smile, he feels that Dina has exceeded his expectations. Dina looks desperately at Andreas and marvels at how fast he is. Andreas stands nonchalantly with his back to her. He turns around to face her and smiles defiantly. He asks Dina to entertain him some more. Inside, Dina is getting high that Andreas is enjoying the fight with her. But she doesn't show it to him. She furiously realizes that Andreas is not the least bit afraid of her, and is only laughing. She loudly screams at him that he pisses her off. Dina is outraged beyond belief. She raises her hands up, forming a bright flame of fire around her. She commands him not to underestimate her. The announcer in the arena announces that Andreas stands calmly in front of her and watches carefully for what she will do next. Encourages them to. Lucia, watching from the podium, admiringly notes that Dina has amazing mana power and that she is far beyond the level of a student. Vivian, confused, realizes that she is very strong. Dina is very focused. She thinks about the fact that she has never been able to do this trick before, but she feels that now she will succeed. Spreading her legs wide, Dina raises her hands palms up and begins to emit fire spears with explosive effect from them. Andreas smiles and notes that this is a great idea. He prepared himself to immediately dodge the spears. The expression on his face changes quickly. He looks questioningly at what is happening in front of him.
A wave of fire is coming at Andreas. You can see bright flashes everywhere.
Dina turns back around and looks at Andreas. She is amazed at what she has accomplished. Andreas instantly forms a defense around himself to prevent the fire wave from reaching him. He exhales and smiles. He realizes that if he didn't protect his body with mana, things would be bad. He feels that it's already hard to use spatial magic, but Dina combined attack magic with dual summoning.
In the knight's faculty.
Dina is absolutely blown away by the fact that Andreas was able to stand up to the fiery spear she fired from the teleporter with just physical strength alone. She starts to wonder if he's even human. Dina puts her hand to her. Dina's released spears don't come close to Andreas. He is amazed by Dina's speed, which is beyond his expectations. Dina continues to stand in the same pose, but no longer emits anything from her hands.
He's to meet her.
Andreas looks smug. He notes that he loves seeing how quickly the game characters get better. Suddenly, there is such a massive explosion in the arena that it is impossible to see what is left on it. Lucius looks around the arena in amazement and realizes that after being hit by such an explosion in Andreas, so close, Vivian stares embitteredly at the arena, not taking her eyes off. She wonders if Dina is trying to kill someone. Watching the smoke from the explosion and the ashes flying around, Dina laughs evilly. She is happy that she has succeeded. Dina is smiling happily. She is proud of herself and very happy to have defeated such a strong opponent as Andreas Cromwell. He reproaches. Suddenly, a bright red streak bursts through the wall of fire and demolishes Dina. Andreas emerges from the fire unharmed. Dina sits on her knees, confused, and sees that there is a hole in the floor in front of her. She is embarrassed that this has happened to the arena that her daddy has personally repaired and strengthened. Andreas slowly approaches her. He tells her that she made a great showing and thanks her. After a pause, he asks Dina to let him now show something exciting to her as well. Dina looks at him questioningly, not realizing herself how he's still in one piece after such an explosion. Andreas holds the Galaxer sword tightly in his hand and explains to Dina that he needs to surround it with aura first. At that moment, a black veil begins to form around the sword. He goes on to say that after he rearranges the aura mana, you need to apply a spell on it. At that moment, a black haze completely envelops the sword. Andreas raises his sword right up to his face and smiles. He says that you can cast a spell using aura rather than magic, and that his magic combines mana and sword. Later, if he has some free time, a fierce battle between two strong rivals from the Faculty of Magic unfolds in the arena. A black haze envelops the entire arena. Many spectators are mesmerized, waiting for the action. Dina jumps high up, holding a pink-colored magic ball in her hands. Many magical shapes formed around her, resembling honeycombs. Dina gasps as she begins to lose her strength. She looks at Andreas carefully, wrinkling her face. Andreas stands, pulling back his sword with a black haze flickering around him. Dina stands opposite him, holding a magic orb surrounded by a wall. In front of Dina, a black magical mass begins to glow from Andreas's strike with the Galaxer sword. She looks at Andreas perplexed, her mouth wide open. Hard to work your way up with magic. Andreas smiles, looking at Dina. He can't believe she blocked. Dina tosses her robe aside. She tells Andreas that she didn't think he had such a trump card up his sleeve. She clarifies that it's all thanks to his double core. Andreas smiles slyly and tells her that's the way it is, though technically he does it at the expense of the vessel trait. Corridor in which Andreas squints thoughtfully to the side. He's sure that someone has already realized that he doesn't have a regular double core. Mr. Alwyn stares angrily at what is happening in the arena. He clenches his teeth in indignation.
Alwyn is pissed off to the max! He folds his arms across his chest and is amazed at how Andreas dared to hurt Dina with the sword he gave him.
There. But there is one. The bearded man sitting next to him says he uses magic with his aura. Sweat dripped down the bearded man's face, and he wondered if that was possible. Alwyn looked at him indignantly, but said nothing. Alwyn ponders the bearded man's words. He reasoned that such a thing could be done if there were no boundaries between aura and mana, and if the body were turned into a magical reservoir. Dina stands frustrated and looks at Andreas. She feels her mana is almost running low. She still has energy for 3 big spells, but she'll have to be careful with Andreas's strange sword fire and his melee attacks. Andreas's hand clenches tightly into a fist. He has the advantage in close combat, so Dina has to dodge and land the decisive blow. Andreas looks at Dina thoughtfully and asks her what she's thinking so hard about in the middle of a fight. Vivian lowers her head and smiles enigmatically. She answers him that she is thinking about how she can defeat him. Andreas smiles slightly. It pleases him to hear her say things directly.
Andreas prepares to attack. He spreads his legs wide to make a leap. He jumps high above Dina, swinging his sword. At that moment, he says that he wants to win too. Dina stares at him in amazement. And the original content, Dina is illuminated by a pink light. Andreas runs past her, swinging his sword. People who have... Andreas himself does not realize what is happening to him. He looks around in bewilderment. He turns his attention to the robe lying on the ground that Dina had discarded. A glowing image can be seen beneath the robe. Dina throws light balls at Andreas. Andreas manages to jump aside as a huge explosion occurs behind him. 5 days. Andreas concentrates on trying to get through the bright flashes of fire and pillars of smoke. Andreas moves away from Dina, who is aiming right behind him. She's illuminated by a bright pink light. The arena. Dina starts emitting sparkling lightning bolts from his palms. The look on his face is focused and dangerous. Lightning cobras reach massive proportions. Light beams combine into scary monsters with wide-open mouths. Calm. The announcer and Andreas is holding a ball of light in his hand. He tells Dina that lightning won't work on it, since his best element is earth. As the bright lightning bolts created by Dina head towards Andreas, he forms an earth shield in front of him to protect himself. In an instant, the earth shield begins to crack and collapse right before his eyes. He looks on in horror. Andreas's eyes go wide. He realizes that he's really screwed up. Lightning bolts of light envelop Andreas's body. He wrinkles his nose in pain. He realizes that his magic ability, besides which he still uses physical enhancement and fusion magic. This way, he won't be able to fully create an earth shield in battle.
In a second,
Dina is laughing gloatingly. She has a cocky look on her face. She holds a fireball in one hand and lightning bolts in the other. She smirks and asks Andreas about letting his guard down. He tells Andreas is having a hard time getting out of the net of glowing lightning. He feels bad that he lost to Dina so easily. Dina clutches the fireball tightly in her hand. She looks smug. She proudly announces to Andreas that the victory is hers. The arena is abuzz with cheers from the audience. The announcer announces that the match is over. He comments that Dina smartly pushed Andreas out of the arena. Andreas crouches confusedly on one knee. Dina stands on the other side of the arena, almost exhausted. He contemplates the fact that Dina could have left him unconscious, but instead she just threw him back. Andreas smiles peacefully, covering his eyes. He is pleased with her decision, and he guesses that what happened on the snowy mountains has left its mark on her. A worthy opponent. Dina smiles sweetly and winks. The announcer announces that she has won the championship spot for the 58th Rodlin Academy Spring Tournament, and that the competition is over. Straight for Dina to... On the podium stand the first, second, and third place winners. Dina takes the honorable first place and holds the golden trophy. Andreas stands upset in the second place. Vivian indifferently takes the third place. Andreas comforts himself with the thought that for his second place finish, he receives a scholarship that fully covers his tuition. Dina, slightly embarrassed, stands and holds the goblet. She too receives a stipend and is also given an elixir that will increase her mana reservoir. Dina, confused, stands in third place. She receives a scholarship that pays for her final year of school. Perfectly! On the wooden door number 506 hangs a nameplate that reads, Andreas Cromwell. Andreas stands and looks around the office. He concludes that this lab is a bit smaller than Karen's, but will do as well. The security level is exactly the same here. Now it will be easier for him to repair undead and delve deeper into dark magic. He opens his eyes wide in amazement. In the corner of the office, there is a huge table with a lot of test tubes and flasks. In the middle of the room is a small coffee table with 2 armchairs.
Andreas bought this laboratory for himself with the money he got from the tournament. And marvels at how fast Andreas had a lot of work to do, finding a skill for the sword and defensive skills related to dark magic, so he needs this. He's glad that thanks to the scholarship, he doesn't have to work to pay his tuition now. Now Andreas has 9 billion wills in his account. Even after buying a house and other major expenses, he still has a lot of money left over. Andreas stares intently at the tablet screen and studies his bank account. He realizes that he has enough money and that he would have been better off with a potion instead of a scholarship like Dina. She'll be even stronger now. A tree of fire appears behind Andreas. Andreas reasoned that thanks to the vessel and the original sin, he already has a lot of mana in his body. But given what the future holds, he needs to increase his mana as much as possible. And Andreas recalled Andreas lying in Vivian's arms. After that incident, the volume of his mana expanded noticeably. The electronic scoreboard says that the Apocalypse Codex, I0, purest original sin, has discovered magnanimous greed. The Apocalypse Codex, Chapter 2, magnanimous greed, has submitted to purest original sin. Andreas and Vivian stare in horror at Andreas's chest, from which strange tentacles are bursting out and light is emanating. Andreas watches in horror at the tentacles slowly disappearing into his body. The electronic scoreboard reads that Codex Apocalypse, Chapter 0, purest original sin, temporarily becomes the owner of magnanimous greed. Amazed at what she has accomplished, Andreas's eyes are wide open. He doesn't understand what's happening to him. The scoreboard says that Apocalypse Codex, I0, is the purest original sin, is now linked to magnanimous greed. Basic abilities have been strengthened, and additional skills have been added. It goes on to write that mana recovery and mana sensitivity have been increased. Special skills can be used once every 6 days. The quality of mana will be increased over time. The nature of mana will become closer to darkness. Andreas pauses thoughtfully by his desk. He feels that after synchronizing with greed, his mana has increased significantly. Andreas thinks back to the moment when he first summoned Nickel. At that time he had spent 25% of his mana, and now he was spending 1% or even less, considering that Nickel was no longer a normal skeleton now. Andreas seriously contemplates the fact that he might now be able to summon 100 regular skeletons at once. Explosion. The scoreboard says his strongest traits are Vessel, Evolution, Enlightenment, and Original Sin. His talents are Black Magic, Advanced Necromancy, Elemental Magic, Water, Dexterity, Combat, and Mana. Andreas adopts a determined pose. Now he will be able to summon a huge army, use the bond of sword and magic, and even let the Original Sin. He is proud that with such parameters, he does not have to worry about the upcoming events. A red streak bursts through the wall of Andreas looks at the tablet screen and sees a familiar face. His only concern is that his intervention has disrupted the event, and now there is an event with exchange students that was not originally held because of Karen's death. Arena that her daddy has personally. Andreas puts his hand on the tablet. He thinks about what is important now. Not that some events have changed, because he still has a lot of information. What he needs to know now is how they have changed and who is responsible. Andreas looks confidently away, thinking that he can definitely bring the game to a happy ending. Lucia's surprised face appears in front of Andreas. She asks him with interest that he also goes to this subject. Andreas sits tiredly at his desk. He tells Lucia that she usually skips school, but she always comes to potions class. Lucia walks over to the desk and replies that it's because the professors want geniuses like her to come to them. Andreas raises his... Lucy remembers something and leans back on her desk. She asks Andreas if he is free after class. Andreas, without looking in her direction, asks her what she wanted. A fierce battle between two strong rivals. Lucia takes a seat at the desk and explains to him that she is working on a new potion and that she could use his help. Andreas guesses that it concerns a potion for her recovery. Andreas looks askance at Lucia and asks what potion are we talking about. Lucia excitedly tells him that she mixed frog tongue muxus with magic pollen the day before yesterday, and then added some yttrium solution and slug kernels. She enigmatically asks Andreas if he has any idea what happened. Pulling back his sword with a black haze, Andreas's eyes go wide because he immediately guesses what might have happened there. Lucia snaps her fingers and looks slyly at Andreas. Without waiting for him to answer, she says that the solution has dissolved and disappeared. Her mouth wide open. Andreas looks at her perplexed and thinks about the fact that he didn't tell her anything, and that she found the cure for her illness on her own. Andreas is sullenly convinced of how talented Lucius and Dina are. At this point,
Lucius puts her hands up and starts sobbing loudly. She says then things didn't go as well as she would have liked, though technically he does it at the expense of. Andreas calmly asks her about how he can help her. He guiltily explains that he doesn't have any free time right now, but he'll be sure to find some later. Lucia lies down on her desk and turns away from Andreas resentfully. She tisks and tells Andreas how he can say no when a pretty student calls him for help. Andreas pretends to write something in his notebook and looks suspiciously at a distraught Lucia. Andreas looks at Lucia confusedly and thinks about the fact that they still have time, because Lucia is going to live until her affliction overcomes her. He can't help her now, because there are those who are in more danger than she is. But said nothing. Images of young people appear before Andreas, a girl with pink hair and a guy with blue hair. They are Selena and Chris. They are game characters who have just enrolled in the academy and have become classmates of Luis. Dina stands frustrated. A lot of horrible creatures with red eyes look enraged and distraught. Andreas must make Selena and Chris stronger before the first storyline begins. Andreas is seriously thinking about the fact that this is the first plot, so it won't be very difficult. But if they don't get stronger, they might just die. And land that. Andreas glances guiltily at Lucia lying on the desk. He is glad that she won't be involved thanks to her work with the potion. He remembers Dina's serious face during the tournament. She had exceeded his expectations. He remembers Luis, who is looking at his hands in amazement. Andreas is sure that he will be all right, because he can get better on his own without his help. To make a leap. Andreas wanted to skip class and go straight to Selena and Chris, but that's when the teacher walks into the office. The teacher places the 2 volumes of magic books on the table and greets the students kindly, wishing them a good morning. People who have the best. The entire auditorium is filled with students. The teacher stands at his desk and announces to them that he will be leading them in mixing and creating potions. Discarded. A respectable man in a burgundy vest stands in front of the students. He looks serious and focused. He introduces himself as Kyler Schutzman. The teacher squeezes out a smile and frowns his eyebrows. He says it's a pleasure to meet you. He has a very piercing look in his eyes. Andreas knows that he is the boss of the first story. The flask is heated with a candle. The teacher points to it with his hand and explains that if you mix the Platris potion with purified Kala water, red coloring and black bubbles appear. Andreas doesn't listen to what the teacher is telling him. He only thinks about meeting Selena and Chris at the Knights training ground. He is sure that they are practicing hard to catch up with Luis. Work on it. The teacher announces that this is the end of the lecture and stares intently at Andreas, adjusting his tie. Andreas looks at the teacher and thinks about the fact that he should have realized by now that he's a black mage because of that laziness incident. But he's not really interested in Andreas. He looks on. Andreas looks at the teacher as he leaves the classroom. He stops in the doorway, feeling someone's piercing gaze on him. Lightning. Teacher Kyler cautiously watches the entrance and quietly calls someone on a phone that looks like a mere mirror. He says there's something he needs to discuss with him. He stares intently into the phone, his lips tight. He addresses his interlocutor, Mr. Jester. On the other end of the phone is Jester, still in the same attire, wearing a black robe and a hat covering his face. He asks Kyler what's wrong, why he's calling him all of a sudden. Kyler is thinking about Bach Alwyn. He informs Jester that Alwyn is beginning to suspect him of something. With great regret, he says that he will soon have to leave the academy because of this. Tightly in her hand, Jester can't believe what he's saying. He asks if it has to do with Charon's death. A large office with a huge number of rooms looks unremarkable. Kyler replies to Jester that this is not out of the question and that the tip-off leaked from his private office. Jester tenses up. Based on the phone call, Kyler is starting to get really scared. Jester recalls images of his assistants, Ranox, Hosan, and Charon. Ranox and Hosan are dead. The crown is gone. Heron's mistake causes Kyler to leave. And he guesses that what happened on the snow. Jester clutches the mirror phone tightly in his hand. He is horrified to recognize that the acolytes have suffered heavy losses as well. He is angry that things are not going according to plan. Kyler holds a flask of black liquid with one hand. In front of him lies a dead animal. Jester asks him about when he's going to come out. He answers him that very soon, and that there will be a meeting of the students of the Milko and Rodlin academies. Soon. Jester stares incomprehensibly at the mirror phone screen and asks Kyler what he's referring to. Kyler pours the black liquid from the flask into a narrow test tube. He asks Jester a question about whether or not he has ever thought that before Kyler leaves,
It would be better to destroy these imperial youths before they become a problem for them. The thought makes Kyler's face take on a satisfied look. On the wooden door number 500, Jester listens intently to Kyler and notes that it's not a bad idea. Kyler stands in front of his desk and informs Jester that he's going to disappear in the middle of the confusion and that he'll report back to him later. Jester says briefly that he understands and disconnects. He puts the mirror phone on the edge of the table. He walks down a dark corridor with a red carpet on the floor. He walks and reflects on the fact that the people he put in the academy are gone. Armchair. Jester walks slowly down the gloomy corridor. The dim light of street lamps from the street can be seen from the windows. He walks over to the window and looks out into the distance. He decides that since they've come to this, he'll have to drag Andreas Cromwell to the meeting. A gloomy castle with 3 domes with crosses also stands in the forest wilderness. This building is Mr. Jester's home, and the exterior completely describes him. It's a warm day. Selena Arestial is actively practicing with a huge black sword. You can tell by her look that she's tired of pulling it. She grips the hilt of the sword tightly with both hands and tries to swing it as hard as she can. But she doesn't have the strength anymore. The sword point is thrust straight into the ground. She rests her head on a huge sword and tries to catch her breath by bending over slightly. Next to her on her right side is a rack of all kinds of swords. A little farther away from Selena, Chris is actively practicing. He has his arm out in front of him and is swinging his sword with the other. He's getting pretty good at it. Drops of sweat run down Selena's face. She feels that she is exhausted and that she urgently needs a break. Chris, ignoring Selena, continues to swing his sword with concentration. Sweat drips down his face, but he's not ready to stop. Selene stands poised on her sword and looks toward Chris, marveling at his stamina. Disappearing into his... She good-naturedly calls out to Chris and suggests he get some rest, or else if he overdoes it, it will be bad. It's as if Chris doesn't hear her. Chris Yuner rests the sharp sword on his shoulder and looks at Selena with arrogance. He tells her to worry about herself, not him. And what's happening to... Selena heads closer to Chris, dragging her sword behind her. She calls him impenetrable and asks him if he watched the finals of the competition, linked to magnanimous greed. Chris, slightly out of breath, continues to train with even more excitement. Swinging his sword, he replies to Selena that he didn't watch the finals because he was practicing. 6 days. Selena points the index finger of one hand upward in admiration and tells Chris that there was this incredible guy there at the competition who could use a sword and magic at the same time. After synchronizing with Chris, mockingly clarifies what she means to say that the underdog who couldn't master a single thing made it to the finals. He tells her with indifference that he didn't go there for nothing. Selena stands and looks at him. She tells him that he just didn't see anything. That's why he says that. Chris laughs demonstratively and continues his workout without taking a break from the conversation. Selene says she heard that Luis also recognized the merits of that guy. Andreas walks over to them and listens to their conversation. Chris, without turning around to face Selena, wonders how Luis recognized a chump like Andreas. He says that it seems like Luis just doesn't know about these things. Selena is amused by his words. Andreas stands silently behind her back. And even let the... Suddenly they hear someone's words behind them, and their faces change. Andreas tells Chris that it's not okay for a first-timer to talk like that about older people he's never met. Andreas puts one hand to his chin and holds the other on his chest. He looks thoughtful. At this moment, Selene looks at him dumbfounded and can't believe her eyes. She opens her mouth wide and continues to hold onto her sword. Chris stands smugly and looks at Andreas. He challenges him about who he is. At that moment, Selena recognizes him and tries to stop Chris. Andreas is outraged that he doesn't know who he is. Bring the game to a happy ending. Andreas announces with defiance that he is the same dork from the magic department who has a sword hanging from his belt. Selena stares at him, eyes wide with admiration. Andreas sits tiredly at his desk. She bows down to Andreas and says she's sorry. She tries to explain that Chris is too proud when it comes to fencing, so he can allow himself extra. Andreas looks at her with arrogance. Andreas doesn't understand what pride we're talking about, because he sees no reason to be proud of his fencing. He says that Chris is like a wimp who can't say something to his girlfriend when she cheats on him. Selena's face changes. And Andreas's words get to Chris's very soul. His face changes. His eyes become dark and gloomy, his brow furrowed. Chris is greatly annoyed by Andreas's words.
He realizes that he has hit the very spot and is amazed that he was able to realize it just by looking at him. Yttrium solution, and without giving the appearance of being hurt by Andreas's words, he smirks and asks him about what a mage who stands out as a knight could possibly know. Celine tries to calm him down. What might have happened there? Andreas looks at him with undisguised arrogance and replies to him that he certainly knows more than he does. Chris is hurt by his words. He senses the challenge in them. He takes an undisguised serious look and offers Andreas to prove it. Andreas, with an undisguised smile on his face, tells him that it would be no problem for him. At that moment, he's fully convinced that Chris is a loser. Andreas and Chris stand face to face. Selena swings between them, trying to calm both of them down, scaring them that the academy will suspend them if they fight. Andreas looks cocky and smiles slyly. Chris, on the other hand, looks annoyed. Chris irritatedly replies to Selena that they are just going to spar as practice. Selena gets angry and tells him not to get smart. But when a pretty student calls at this time, Andreas walks over to the table and chooses a sword that suits him. He doesn't use his magic sword to stay on equal footing. Chris and Selena watch him with interest. Andreas says that sparring is not a problem for him. Andreas chooses a sword that suits him and heads towards them, sword in hand. He promises. Selena looks fearfully at Andreas heading towards them. Chris looks completely calm and unperturbed. Chris looks at Andreas with a smile on his face and notes that for a mage, he's a daredevil. Selena looks at him fearfully. In the academy, and Andreas raises his sword point up and tells Chris to attack him, calling him a first year. The words he says hurt Chris. Chris has a cocky smile on his face as he puts his sword out, pointing it at Andreas. He tells him that he hopes he doesn't regret it. Andreas is slightly taken aback by his self-assurance. He stares at him nonchalantly with his lips pressed together. Selena spiritedly offers Andreas to spar with him. After all, it's not often you get the chance to fight someone who can use mana and aura at the same time. Chris looks at her in surprise. Andreas looks at Selena nonchalantly and tells her to get ready as it will soon be her turn as well. Selena can't believe her ears. She looks happy. Her eyes express undisguised joy and anticipation. But that's when Chris turns to her and apologizes and tells her it won't be her turn. Selena looks at him apprehensively. At that moment, Chris jumps out of his seat and disappears somewhere. Selena looks around in bewilderment. Chris finds himself next to Andreas and viciously attacks him with his sword. Andreas, meanwhile, effortlessly defends himself against him with his sword. Vest stands in front. Chris flies a short distance away from Andreas's blow. Selena looks on fearfully from the sidelines. Chris is getting even angrier and tougher. Sweat spurts from his face, his cheekbones clenched. Andreas stands nonchalantly to the side, legs spread wide, and waits for Chris's further attack. Chris jumps up and tries to strike Andreas in the neck with his sword. Andreas, at this time, nonchalantly puts his sword up to prevent the blow. Andreas smiles. He's convinced that Chris is fast, but it's nothing like the Unor style, one of the 5 great styles of fencing. Training ground. He leaps from his seat and heads sharply for Chris, leaving behind him a puff of dust. Andreas actively attacks Chris, professionally swinging his sword. He, in turn, is not badly defended. Selena is watching from the sidelines, frightened. Andreas dodges a punch. He realizes that Chris is moving the plot forward at the expense of focusing heavily on sword wielding. Andreas swings his sword with all his might and hits right on Chris's stomach. The one in the moment flies off into the distance and falls to the ground. Andreas sees that Chris is now not using the Unor style at all, which is characterized by its speed and constantly changing sword trajectory. He stares intently. Chris gets up off the ground at the same second and rubs his face. He's not going to give up. Andreas can see that he's been taking on everything in an attempt to keep up with Luis and that he's moving very strangely now. Asks Kyler. Andreas's sword begins to glow blue. Andreas decides that he will set Chris on the right path. Andreas looks at Chris defiantly, pointing his sword at him, and tells him to stop messing around. He demands that he show him everything he knows, tightly in her hand. Chris's teeth clenched, drops of sweat are dripping from his face. He defiantly tells Andreas to watch! Chris assumes an attack pose and swings his sword. He tells Andreas not to regret it later. He begins to demonstrate the Unor style. He swings his sword in such a way that a circle of light forms around it and sharp ends. Andreas immediately guesses that Chris is using the sword howl technique. He makes no attempt to attack but simply stands with his sword held forward. Chris looks confused, his eyebrows furrowed, his mouth wide open. Just Andreas, for his part, looks calm and calculating. He looks at Chris carefully. bosses as well. There is a loud explosion. It illuminates everything around with a bright flash of light. Andreas slices Chris's sword with one swipe of his hand so that it shatters into small shards. Andreas stands at Chris's back and asks him about what he is the one calling Unor style. These words hit Chris hard. He stops. Chris drops the severed sword from his hand. Andreas asks him about what he thinks he can become strong if he takes the best aspects of different styles. About whether or not he has ever... Andreas turns his head at him and advises him to stick to his own path and not to question it. Andreas, turning his head slightly at him, says that this would be the surest way. The words hit Chris in the heart. He stands, thoughtful, with his back to Andreas. He feels hurt that he was so quick to kill him. Kyler stands in front of his... Andreas turns to Selena and says it's her turn to show what she can do. Selena looks at him confused. Selena angrily grabs her sword and yells to Andreas that she is ready. Selena is the complete opposite of Chris. Her family's fencing style kills her good sides. This style only suits those born strong. That the people he put in the... Andreas stands nonchalantly and looks at Selena. He tells her to start attacking him. Selena jumps out of her seat lightning fast and runs at Andreas, swinging her huge sword. At that moment, she angrily shouts that she is starting. Andreas smiles slyly. He tells her to attack as he has much to teach her. Andreas hits Selena with such force that she flies off a great distance with her legs held high. Selena is on her knees on the ground, trying to get up from her seat and continue the fight. Andreas waits impatiently for her next move. Look. Chris stares mesmerized at Andreas and is amazed that he immediately recognized Selena's weakness. Selena looks fearfully at Andreas and cannot believe what has happened, for she has put all her power. Andreas puts the sword he was using back in its place. He walks over to Selena and explains to her that the heavy sword is working against her. Next to her, Selena angrily tries to explain to him that she's always used a sword like this. Selena, standing behind her, Chris folds his arms across his chest and tells Selena that Andreas is completely right. Selena, not believing her ears, turns to Chris and tries to say something to him. But Chris interrupts her and goes on to say that Andreas was right and in his case. Andreas interrupts their dialogue and asks them what they both picked up their swords for. Selena looks at him in surprise. Chris also looks at Andreas incomprehensibly, frowning his eyebrows. Andreas asks the next question about why they keep going down the path of fencing. Chris and Selena look at him perplexed. Chris asks him why he suddenly started asking such a thing. Andreas's face changes. He becomes stern and serious. Her eyebrows frown. He tells them that he picked up a sword so that he would not die. These words strike Selena hard. She stands and stares at him, eyes wide. Chris at this time is seriously considering the words Andreas said. He casts his gaze downward. Finals. Andreas, rolling his eyes slightly, tells them that he's ashamed to admit, but he has no talent for magic. Andreas tells them that due to some circumstances he almost died. He explains that since then, he always carries his sword with him when touching it. He rebukes them for dedicating half of their lives to fencing, but still losing to him. He looks at them piercingly and asks if they understand what he means. Selena and Chris look at Andreas with a focused look. Selena assumes it's because of the difference in talent. Andreas replies emphatically that it is not. Andreas stands with a calm look and tries to explain that they haven't had to use their swords for real yet. He asks them about them swinging swords to defeat someone. Chris frowns his eyebrows even harder and thinks about his question. Selena. Andreas goes on to ask them that perhaps they are waving their swords because of pride, even though the swords don't suit them. Selena realizes that the question is addressed to her and opens her eyes fearfully. Without waiting for a response from them, Andreas proudly replies that he continues to use his sword to live. He looks at Selena and Chris carefully and waits for some sort of answer from them. He asks again about what they need the swords for. Andreas turns to leave and finally tells them to think about it and, if they find the answers to his questions, to come to him any time and he will defeat them again. Selena and Chris stare at him in silence. Suddenly someone's voice calls out to him. Andreas stops. Chris stands behind him and tells him in a serious voice that he will definitely challenge him again. Andreas, without turning to face him, smiles slyly. That he is the